Tension erupts on Late Show as Eastwood-Colbert interview takes shocking turn. Hollywood legend stands his ground after host's repeated jabs. "You've picked the wrong cowboy to bully tonight," Eastwood warns in unprecedented on-air confrontation. The entertainment world is reeling after last night's explosive encounter between legendary actor-director Clint Eastwood and talk show host Stephen Colbert. What began as a standard promotional appearance for Eastwood's latest film quickly descended into one of the most uncomfortable and heated exchanges ever witnessed on late-night television. The tension was palpable from the moment the 94-year-old Hollywood icon took his seat. Eastwood, known for his stoic demeanor and no-nonsense attitude, appeared initially willing to engage in the typical late-night banter. Colbert, however, seemed determined to provoke a reaction from his distinguished guest rather than conduct a professional interview. "Welcome to the show, Mr. Eastwood," Colbert began with his characteristic smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I have to say, I'm surprised you're still making films. Most people your age are struggling to operate the TV remote, not directing major motion pictures." The audience's laughter was noticeably strained, a mixture of discomfort and uncertainty. Eastwood, ever the professional, offered a thin smile in response. "Well, Stephen, when you love what you do, you don't quit just because the calendar says you should," Eastwood replied evenly, attempting to steer the conversation toward his new project. But Colbert seemed uninterested in discussing the film itself. Instead, he launched into a series of increasingly pointed remarks about Eastwood's age, his politics, and his famous empty chair speech from the 2012 Republican National Convention. "You know that empty chair bit you did? I keep thinking how ahead of your time you were," Colbert continued with an exaggerated wink. "Talking to something that isn't there. Given your age, was that practice for conversations with your future caregivers?" The audience's reaction shifted from uncomfortable chuckles to audible gasps. Eastwood's expression hardened, but he maintained his composure. "I came here to talk about my film, Stephen," Eastwood said quietly, his voice carrying that distinctive gravelly tone that had commanded respect throughout his decades-long career. "If you'd done your homework, you might have some questions about it." Colbert, rather than taking the professional cue, doubled down. "Oh, I've got plenty of questions about a man your age still working. Is it financial necessity? Did those divorce settlements clean you out? Or is this just a desperate attempt to stay relevant in an industry that's moved on?" The studio fell silent. Camera operators exchanged nervous glances. The show's producer could be seen frantically gesturing from the wings, but Colbert either didn't notice or chose to ignore the signals. Eastwood sat perfectly still for several seconds, his piercing blue eyes locked on Colbert. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured, reminiscent of his most intimidating on-screen characters. "You know, Stephen, in my day, we had something called respect, especially for guests invited onto our shows. You've spent the last 5 minutes trying to get a rise out of me instead of having a conversation. That tells me more about your character than it does about mine." The audience erupted in spontaneous applause, catching Colbert off guard. His face flushed slightly as he realized the crowd was firmly on Eastwood's side. He fumbled with his note cards, clearly unprepared for his usual tactics to backfire so spectacularly. "I'm just having a bit of fun," Colbert said with a nervous laugh. "That's what we do here. We joke around." "There's a difference between joking and disrespect," Eastwood countered, leaning forward slightly. "And you crossed that line about 3 insults ago. Now, would you like to talk about the film, or should I just leave now and save us both some time?" A palpable tension filled the studio. The director in the control room hurriedly instructed the camera operators to prepare for an emergency commercial break if needed. Backstage, production assistants were frantically texting executives about the unfolding situation. Colbert's smile faltered as he realized he had severely miscalculated. The audience, typically so receptive to his brand of humor, was now squarely aligned with the Hollywood legend. Attempting to regain control of the situation, Colbert cleared his throat and gestured toward a clip from Eastwood's new film that was ready to play. "Let's take a look at a scene from your new project," he said, his voice noticeably less confident than before. "Before we do that," Eastwood interrupted, "I think your viewers deserve an explanation for why you've chosen to conduct this interview. Like you're some kind of schoolyard bully rather than a professional host." The challenge hung in the air between them. Colbert's eyes darted toward the producers off-camera, silently pleading for guidance, or perhaps a convenient technical problem that could cut the segment short. But no rescue was forthcoming. "Mr. Eastwood, Colbert began, but Eastwood raised his hand, cutting him off. "You invited me here under the pretense of discussing my work," Eastwood continued, his voice gaining strength. "Instead, you've spent our time trying to score cheap points at my expense. I've been in this business longer than you've been alive, son. I've faced down directors, studio executives, critics, and cowboys a hell of a lot tougher than you. So, if you think you're going to rattle me with some juvenile jabs about my age or my politics, you've picked the wrong cowboy to bully tonight." The studio audience erupted into applause, many rising to their feet in a spontaneous show of support. For Eastwood, Colbert's face flushed crimson as he struggled to maintain his composure, the control he typically wielded over his show slipping through his fingers. "Well, Colbert stammered, tugging at his tie. "We try to keep things light-hearted here, Mr. Eastwood. Perhaps you're taking this a bit too seriously." Eastwood's eyes narrowed dangerously. "No, Stephen, what you're doing isn't light-hearted. It's disrespectful. Not just to me, but to your audience. They tuned in expecting a conversation, not a hit job." A woman in the front row called out, "He's right," others murmured in agreement. Colbert glanced nervously at the crowd, realizing the tide had turned decisively against him. "Look, why don't we take a quick break and—" Colbert began, desperately seeking an escape route. "No breaks," Eastwood cut in. "You wanted this confrontation, Stephen. You've been pushing for it since I walked out here. So let's have it. Man to man." The camera cut to a wide shot, capturing both men in frame. The contrast was striking. Eastwood, though in his 90s, sat ramrod straight, emanating the quiet confidence that had made him an icon. Colbert, meanwhile, fidgeted with his pen looking younger but somehow diminished. "You know what I think, Stephen?" Eastwood continued, his voice dropping to that familiar menacing whisper that had sent chills down the spines of movie villains for decades. "I think you're scared. Scared because you know you're not as clever as you think you are. You hide behind your writers and your rehearsed jokes. But when you're faced with someone who won't play your game, you don't know what to do." An uncomfortable silence fell over the studio. Backstage, producers were frantically debating whether to force a commercial break, but nobody wanted to be the one to cut off Clint Eastwood mid-speech. Colbert attempted to regain control with a forced laugh. "Mr. Eastwood, with all due respect, this is my show, and on my show I—" "Respect?" Eastwood scoffed. "You don't know the meaning of the word. Respect isn't something you demand because your name is on the marquee. It's something you earn. And right now, son, you're not earning any." The audience murmured in agreement. A young production assistant whispered to a colleague, "Is this being streamed live?" The other nodded grimly. "Mr. Eastwood," Colbert said, his voice taking on an edge, "I've interviewed presidents, world leaders, and yes, plenty of Hollywood legends. None of them have had a problem with my interview style. Perhaps the issue is that you can't take a joke anymore." "Oh, I can take a joke," Eastwood replied coolly, "when it's actually funny. But there's nothing funny about a host who ambushes his guests for cheap laughs. That's not comedy, Stephen. That's bullying." Social media was already exploding with clips of the exchange. Colbert vs. Eastwood was trending, with the vast majority of comments supporting Eastwood. The network executives were watching the metrics in real time, witnessing as Colbert's favorability. Ratings plummeted by the minute. "You know what I've learned in my 90-plus years on this planet?" Eastwood continued. True character shows itself when the cameras are rolling and the script goes out the window. Your writers can't save you now. This is just you and me having an honest conversation. And honestly, I'm disappointed. A tense silence fell over the studio. Even the band had stopped their usual interjections, watching the confrontation unfold, with the same stunned fascination as everyone else. Disappointed? Colbert repeated, indignation rising in his voice. I've won multiple Emmys for this show. Our ratings— I don't give a damn about your Emmys, Eastwood interrupted. Awards don't make you a decent human being. I've been in this business since before television was in color. I've seen hosts come and go. The ones who last, the ones who matter. They never forget that their guests are people, not punching bags. Colbert's producer was now visibly panicking, making frantic cutting motions from the side of the stage. But Colbert, perhaps sensing that any attempt to silence Eastwood would only make things worse, remained frozen in place. You were once a promising talent, Eastwood continued, his voice softening slightly, carrying a hint of genuine regret. I watched your early work. You had something authentic then. But somewhere along the way, you traded authenticity for cheap shots and political points. That's the real tragedy here. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on Eastwood's every word. Even those who had come as Colbert fans were mesmerized by the Hollywood legend's unflinching honesty. Mr. Eastwood, Colbert said, his voice lower now, struggling to maintain his composure. I think you're being unfair. We approached you about coming on the show to promote your film. We've allocated time for clips. After spending the first half of the segment trying to humiliate me, Eastwood interrupted. That was your choice, Stephen. And choices have consequences. The tension in the studio was electric. Camera operators exchanged anxious glances, uncertain whether they should continue filming or prepare for an abrupt end to the segment. Colbert, realizing he needed to regain control of the situation before it spiraled further, attempted a reconciliatory approach. Perhaps we got off on the wrong foot. Why don't we start fresh and talk about your new film? Eastwood regarded him silently for a long moment. The entire studio held its breath, waiting for his response. It's a little late for that, don't you think? Eastwood finally replied. You don't get to throw punches and then call for a friendly match when you realize you're losing. The audience murmured in agreement, several people nodding their heads. Colbert's forced smile completely vanished now, replaced by a look of genuine concern. This was no longer about salvaging an interview. It was about salvaging his reputation. Mr. Eastwood, Colbert tried again, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. I think there's been a misunderstanding about the tone of our show. We push boundaries here. That's what our viewers expect. Don't hide behind your viewers, Eastwood countered, gesturing toward the audience. Ask them if they came here tonight expecting to watch an elderly man get ridiculed. Go ahead, ask them, Colbert glanced nervously at the crowd, then back at his guest. He knew better than to take that suggestion. The studio audience's loyalty had clearly shifted. Look, I apologize if my approach came across as disrespectful, Colbert said, the words clearly difficult for him to articulate. That wasn't my intention. Wasn't it? Eastwood leaned forward, pinning Colbert with his gaze. You've made a career out of ambushing guests who don't share your views. You prep your audience to laugh at the right moments, stack the deck with pre-written jokes, and then act surprised when someone calls you on it. From the corner of his eye, Colbert could see his producer frantically signaling for a commercial break. He gave a slight nod, grateful for the potential escape. We'll be right back after these messages, Colbert announced, turning toward the camera with visible relief. Running away, Stephen? Eastwood asked quietly, just loud enough for the microphones to pick up. Colbert froze, trapped between the imminent commercial break and Eastwood's challenge. The cameras continued rolling, capturing his indecision. We have sponsors to acknowledge, Colbert replied weakly. Of course you do, Eastwood nodded. Business is business. But when we come back, I expect we'll actually discuss my film, not your predetermined narrative about me." The red lights on the cameras blinked off as the show cut to commercial. Immediately, a swarm of producers descended upon the stage. Colbert removed his earpiece, ignoring their frantic questions and advice. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, leaning toward his guest as makeup artists dabbed at his forehead. "Off camera now, I want to apologize sincerely. This interview has gotten away from both of us." Eastwood regarded him calmly. "It didn't get away from me, Stephen. I knew exactly what I was doing." One of the executive producers approached Eastwood. "Mr. Eastwood, we completely understand if you'd prefer to end the segment now. We can make an announcement that you weren't feeling well." "I'm feeling fine," Eastwood interrupted. "Better than I have in years, actually. There's something refreshing about speaking your mind." 30 seconds, called out the floor director. Colbert adjusted his tie, visibly composing himself. "How would you like to proceed when we return?" "Simple," Eastwood replied. "You ask me about my film. I answer. Like a normal interview between professionals." Colbert nodded, a hint of humble gratitude in his expression. "I can do that." 5 seconds, the floor director announced. As the cameras went live again, viewers noticed an immediate shift in Colbert's demeanor. Gone was the smug superiority, replaced by a more genuine, almost deferential approach. "Welcome back," Colbert said to the camera. "We're here with legendary director and actor Clint Eastwood, discussing his latest film, Final Stand. Mr. Eastwood, this project represents your return to the Western genre that defined much of your early career. What drew you back to those roots?" Eastwood considered the question, then nodded slightly, acknowledging the shift to a more respectful tone. "It's about legacy," he answered thoughtfully. "When you reach my age, you start thinking about what stories are left to tell. This one had been with me for decades, but I needed the right perspective to do it justice. Sometimes you have to leave something behind before you can come back to it with fresh eyes." For the next 7 minutes, the two men engaged in what many critics would later call one of the most compelling interviews in late-night television history. Colbert, humbled but professional, asked insightful questions about the filmmaking process. Eastwood, recognizing the change, responded with detailed, thoughtful answers that revealed the depth of his artistic vision. As the segment neared its conclusion, Colbert addressed the elephant in the room. "Mr. Eastwood, before we wrap up, I want to acknowledge what happened earlier. I approached this interview with preconceptions that were unfair to you and, frankly, beneath the standards I should hold myself to. I appreciate you calling me out on it." The audience broke into supportive applause, surprised by the host's candor. Eastwood studied Colbert for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "Apology accepted. You know, in my films I've always been interested in characters who can change, who can recognize their mistakes and grow from them. That's what separates the heroes from the villains in the end." "A lesson worth remembering," Colbert replied, humility evident in his voice. "Thank you for being here tonight." "Thanks for having me," Eastwood said, offering his hand. Colbert took it, and the two men shared a handshake that, while not exactly warm, carried a newfound mutual respect. As the show cut to its final commercial break, social media exploded with reactions. The hashtag #YarEastwoodsColbert morphed into #YarEastwoodSchoolsColbert, with viewers praising the Hollywood legend for standing his ground with dignity, while simultaneously acknowledging Colbert's eventual willingness to correct course. The following morning, clips of the confrontation dominated news cycles and talk shows. Media analysts dissected every moment, with the majority concluding that Eastwood had delivered a masterclass in commanding respect, without resorting to hostility. Network executives, initially panicked about the confrontation, changed their tune. When preliminary ratings showed the episode had garnered the highest viewership of any late show in 3 years. However, the praise for Eastwood far outweighed support for Colbert, whose favorability ratings had taken a significant hit. 1 week later, Colbert opened his show with an extended monologue about respect in broadcasting, acknowledging that the encounter with Eastwood had prompted some necessary soul-searching about his approach to interviews. He announced several changes to the show's format, promising more substantive conversations and fewer gotcha moments designed to embarrass guests. For his part, Eastwood declined all requests to discuss the incident further in subsequent interviews, simply stating, "We had our say, and that's that." His film opened to strong reviews the following weekend, with several critics noting that the publicity from the Colbert confrontation had likely boosted awareness among demographics not typically drawn to Eastwood's work. The confrontation ultimately transcended both men, becoming a cultural touchstone about civility in public discourse. Journalism schools added the interview to their curriculum as both a cautionary tale and an example of how conflict, when handled with dignity rather than sensationalism, can lead to meaningful dialogue. In Hollywood circles, a new phrase entered: the lexicon. Pulling in Eastwood became shorthand for standing your ground with quiet dignity when faced with disrespect. In writers' rooms across late-night television, hosts and producers began asking themselves a simple question when crafting interviews: how would this play against Clint Eastwood? As for the two men themselves, they never appeared together on television again. But months later, at an industry event, attendees noticed them sharing a brief, private conversation in a corner, away from the cameras. No one heard what was said, but both men were seen nodding in what appeared to be mutual understanding before parting ways with a respectful handshake. A fitting, quiet conclusion to one of television's most memorable confrontations.